Hi, everyone. My name's Amber. I'm an MLE at Arize, and I'm also doing a lot of work with the Arize community. I'm joined today by Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a machine learning engineer at Cisco. I've been working there on the contact center team for about 2.5 years now, which is crazy.
Wow.
Um, and yeah, most of my work is in NLP, but also do some speech related work with text to speech and speech to text.
Yes, a lot of folks when I kind of posted the bio in the channel were very interested in kind of like the NLP aspects, like how they relate, especially kind of like the scalability of it too. But
Yeah.
we'll get into like some questions actually people ask because they couldn't attend the session. But we'll start with just like your journey. A lot of the folks that are joining the community are either in academia or they're in other related positions and they want to make that transition. I know for a fact that you successfully made that transition. So maybe talk a little bit about that and like the key things that helped you make that transition.
Yeah, definitely. So I studied applied math and cognitive science at USC, where I was also involved in research in computational linguistics. So the combination of like the math background and the interest in questions around the nature of intelligence kind of naturally led me to a career in AI and machine learning. And one of the best sort of the way that I transitioned really was through Insight, which is where I met Amber, which really helped kind of get my foot in the door in industry. They helped prepare me for interviews and things like this, which I think really helped coming straight out of college, especially without an advanced degree. But yeah, I'd say just like having a long held interest in language learning and math and science really helped.
Mm-hmm. And like going back to that, because I've had a lot of conversations with folks that say, like, if I wanted to be an AI researcher, an ML engineer, or like an NLP researcher, that I need to have, like an advanced degree in it. And then there's, like, because there's some folks that go straight out of high school and they start coding and doing software development full time. So there's a wide range, but like from your experience, like, do you think that you need that advanced degree or that you can just start learning the material and interviewing for these positions?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I was not sure of myself until I kind of got into it. I'd say it depends on the kind of role that you want. If you are interested in more of a research kind of role, I think it helps a lot to have an advanced degree, or if not an advanced degree, some research experience, which I had, I did my own research all throughout college. So that kind of gave me a really like a leg up, I'd say. That kind of experience was really helpful. But if you're interested in more of the engineering side and more of, I'd say like you don't necessarily need an advanced degree. It's not a requirement. And if you're a strong software developer and coder, then you should be able to study up on your own and do well.
Right. Right. Yeah. So just kind of start exploring the areas you're interested in and seeing if you continue to be interested in it. Right. Just try it first, see what you like. Awesome. I can't believe it's been like 2.5 years that you've been at
I know.
Cisco. So maybe tell us a bit about your day to day, and even because I know like your day to day has changed a lot in those 2.5 years. So kind of like the different roles that you've played at Cisco.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I started, it was just me and my boss and a data engineer. So it was a very small team. And we had zero infrastructure, zero code. Cisco has other AI teams in other parts of the company that do different things, but the contact center didn't have any kind of in-house team doing AI. So when I started, that was a big part of the appeal for me, was like, it's kind of like a startup within this larger company. And I got a chance to take on a lot of responsibility and wear many hats and all of that. So my role, and even today, it's kind of similar. Like I am responsible for all of the data gatekeeping, like collecting, cleaning, labeling, storing, validating the data. Very important. Model development, of course, and also some sort of software development and productionizing the models and
Okay.
deploying them. So I kind of get a little bit of everything, which is
right.
nice.
Yeah, no, that sounds like the full end-to-end pipeline. So maybe we can break that up a little, because there's folks joining and folks that ask for the recording that are at kind of in each one of those like specified states of like the data preparation, the model development, the deployment. So in terms of like those, data pre-processing steps, because obviously like a machine learning model, they say, is only as good as the data going in. What are some best practices that you find around those tasks?
Yeah, let's see. For the data, it's honestly like the most time consuming and important part, I would say. Like you have to make sure that the data is what you want. It starts with collecting the right data, labeling it. Something that we do a lot on our team is that we'll have a small set of the data labeled internally by our own team, so we know that's like our gold set, and we kind of have very high confidence in those labels. And then we'll send a larger amount of data to, say, third-party annotators for labeling, and then an even larger, and then for the rest of the data, we'll use a tool like Snorkel to try and label some of the examples automatically. And then we kind of compare between those sets of labels, like how is the Snorkel model doing compared to the human annotators, and how are the human annotators doing compared to our internally labeled gold set. And it's just kind of an iterative process of making sure that there's agreement between those three kind of tiers of labels. Right. And that's really helpful. But it can be difficult to kind of get it right. And so sometimes we have to adjust the labeling task itself, like make sure that it's more clear to the annotators what they're supposed to do. Because if there's a lot of disagreement in the labels, then it can lead to problems down the line.
Right. And I guess, some of these are going to depend on, I guess, the types of models, the use cases. Like, right. Sometimes, you can have a semi-supervised approach. Sometimes everything like needs to be, very, I guess, just like very perfectly labeled in order to get the kind of results you want. So what are like the top use cases that you're working with every day?
Yeah, so most of the models that I work are NLP models. So we have a lot of large language models, transformers based like T5 and variations of BERT. And we use them for a kind of wide range of tasks. Some are classification, some are question answering tasks. We also have a summarization model that we've built to summarize conversations. And of course, each one of these kind of tasks requires a different set of labels for training and also for evaluation, a different paradigm. Right.
Okay. And so a variety of models for a variety of use cases. When you're in the process of model development, like where do you start? Do you start with something open source? Do you start with kind of like the simplest thing possible? How do you go about figuring out, what model is appropriate for the use case?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something that I think you kind of develop with time, like sources of research, when you're initially deciding which tools fit your use case the best. I think it's always good to start with something simple at first, like the simplest model you can think of. And it's also for looking at sort of state of the art and what's new, the latest research. Papers with Code is a great resource that we use a lot. And we usually try to, at least with the large language models, most of the ones we have in production are pre-trained from like Hugging Face or something similar. So open source models that we then we'll fine tune if necessary. And then others like the smaller models for more specific use cases to our contact center that we'll train from scratch, but we try to use pre-trained when possible.
Mm-hmm. And then over like the past like 2.5 years, like specifically for model development, are there any like, do's or don'ts that you can like share with the folks here that were like really great learning experiences for you?
I'd say one thing to keep in mind always when you're developing a model for production is to keep in mind the sort of end requirements you have in mind. So what kind of latency do you need, and what kind of scale, how many requests per second? Because we're developing at the contact center for models that are going to be used by literally millions of people, we have to keep those things in mind. And it kind of it really narrows down your search a lot. If you need a model that like can do inference in under 1 second, like it cuts out a lot of models. So that's helpful. Other lessons learned. I don't know. I'm kind of drawing a blank on that one.
Yeah, no problem. And I think that is always the most important one that comes to mind when I think of model development too, like keeping that end goal constantly in sight. Because, just wanting to experiment with like the coolest or the most state-of-the-art model is always going to be appealing as a machine learning engineer, but it might not always be the practical solution. It might not solve like for your KPIs.
Right.
So like working with a small team, like, actually knowing like your goals for that, how do you establish those goals of like what you want that model to do? Because obviously, the use case, like this is going to be for, customers, and we want it to look like this, but how do you establish those other KPIs?
Yeah, we work with a product team as well as the engineering team, sort of to understand like what do the customers want, what are their requirements, and then what can our infrastructure kind of handle. We have some initial sort of goals that are established for any kind of project. We want it to be able to handle so many requests per second. And that's just like a Cisco kind of standard thing. So there's not a whole lot of room for discussion over those things. I would say it's kind of like, okay, these are the requirements, let's go. And they're similar across different models.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. And then, so the developing like part of the pipeline, like actually doing the experiments, testing the models, what goes on in a Jupyter notebook isn't always going to help you for once those are actually put into production. That tends to be a major like funnel for a lot of teams. So what are your experiences with like putting a model into production, or like tips around that process?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we have a process of thoroughly testing and evaluating our models, in the lab before we put them into production. And I think getting that right is really important. You want to make sure that the metrics you have and the data you're using to evaluate the models is really spot on, and have it be like more or less an automated process, so you don't have to do a lot of work each time you want to test a new iteration of the model, or each time you get some new test data that you want to include. We use a tool called weights and biases for that, and I found it to be really excellent for this kind of experimentation, as well as kind of data versioning. And then in terms of how to take those tests and the evaluation into production, we do a couple of things. First, we have feedback collection. So we collect both explicit and implicit feedback from our users who are, receiving the predictions of our models.
Right.
So explicit feedback would be things like, thumbs up, thumbs down on the recommendation, or clicks or comments that users leave. And then implicit feedback we collect would look like, for example, we have a model that's a question answering model, and it basically suggests an answer to an agent while they're handling a call. And we can then compare the suggested answer to the bits of conversation that happen after it was suggested. And we can do a semantic similarity measure to determine, like, was that a good answer or not? Did the agent use it? And that's a kind of way that we collect implicit feedback. We haven't collected enough of this feedback, and our models haven't been in production quite long enough to start using this for retraining, but that's the eventual goal, is that we can use this feedback for retraining. But it's also just a good sanity check, to make sure that our models are not like being
going off
heinous. Yeah, like they're performing like more or less as expected.
Okay, because you kind of touched on like my next point of, there's going to be some models that have ground truths, or also known as actuals, back.
Right.
So what models tend to use like those actuals, and what do you do maybe as a proxy to those actuals? Maybe you could give like a specific example of one of the models that you're working with.
Yeah, so when there's a ground truth, that makes it a bit easier. First, so a good example there would be for this question answering model that I was talking about, we have a system that will basically listen to an ongoing conversation between an agent and a caller who needs help with something. And it searches, the model in the background identifies what the caller's intent is and what their question is, and uses it to query a knowledge base, and then surface the most relevant kind of answer to the agent, so that the agent doesn't have to take time to search for it, manually, or, agents often they're not well trained and don't know all the ins and outs of their company that they're working for. So it helps to have that information available. And so in that case, the sort of ground truth is like, what is the correct answer? And during training and development, we have labeled data that we've collected manually, more or less, but in production it's less obvious, right?
Right.
So that's where we've implemented this kind of method of checking implicitly if the agent used the recommendation or not. Of course, it's not a perfect measure, but it does indicate, like, if our suggestions are completely useless, then the agent won't use them, right? So if the agent is using them and repeats back, some bits of the answer to the caller, then we kind of know, okay, at least it like makes sense enough that the agent used it.
Right. And I guess it doesn't have to be just like a straight accuracy or a yes or no. You can always create your own kind of metrics on, is it?
Yeah,
mostly-
we often have custom metrics. Like, very few of our models and tasks are clear cut, like this is a classification, you just need the F1 score, or accuracy. They're often a little bit more nuanced than that, and we've created kind of custom metrics, or a series of metrics that we look at for each task.
Right. And then with these models being put in production, so Arize did a survey of over 1,000 MLEs at different companies and industry. And what they found was only like 1% of the time of that full development like cycle that we were talking about, the data prep, model experimentation, model development, model serving, only 1% of the times actually spent like in production, like on average with teams, which is pretty crazy, because this is how it's performing in the real world. So
Right.
how are you like monitoring your models in production?
Yeah. So in addition to the sort of feedback collection that we kind of check in on every once in a while, we have, it's stored in a database that we can query and see, like, how is the model doing based on the user feedback. But in addition to that, we use a tool called Checklist, which is useful for testing specifically language models. And we use it kind of as a unit test for some of the models that we have in production. And it's actually kind of amazing how many of even the state-of-the-art language models will fail these really simple tests. They're kind of, you set up a set of tests basically based on the model and the use case and your assumptions about what the behavior should be. And then you can run them periodically just as you would any other kind of software test. And it's a good way to just make sure that the model is behaving as expected. And that's what we've been doing so far. It's not perfect and it doesn't work for every type of model.
Right.
But it's definitely a useful tool.
Right. Okay. And then, so, I mean, the type of data you're getting, because it's not very straightforward, there could obviously be a lot of production data quality issues for all those inferences coming in. How do you handle the data quality issues in production?
Like, how do we
like if someone is kind of like, say you're, I mean, this is just one example, but say like your model is region based and it's trained on like capitalized states, and then you're getting feedback or someone's entering in something and all of a sudden like uncapitalized states are coming in, or like essentially if it's a brand new input that your model hasn't seen before, how do you go about kind of storing that so like it doesn't break your model, or it doesn't give you like or it doesn't give you like a very strange reaction, because it's going to happen, like it can always happen. But what are you doing to try to mitigate it as much as possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say that most of that kind of testing and preparation happens during the model development stage, like before we put the models into production, just like making sure that all of our sort of text normalization steps are going to work for all the kind of corner cases that we can think of. And then if things break in production, obviously that's not good. But we usually have some kind of early field trial where we release the models only to like one customer for testing, and they kind of know like, okay, it might be prone to issues, and they let us know if there are issues like that. So far we haven't run into any issues like that though, which is good. Yeah, but like, it's a good question. It's difficult. Like you can't really think of all of the potential corner cases. You just kind of do your best.
Right. Yeah. And also like having that gradual rollout really helps. I'll get to a question from the audience in a second. But one kind of last thing. So in the Arize Observe Summit we had a few weeks ago, we had the founder of UMAP, and Leland McGinnis and Chris Moody, who is very well versed in TS&E, UMAP, like the embeddings. He's an engineer at Stitch Fix, doing a lot of work there. So I'm just curious, like, do you monitor for like embedding drift, or is that something that like you've thought about? Because it seems to be like an emerging topic for like monitoring for drift.
Interesting. I mean, obviously we use embeddings a lot. Most of them are pre-trained embeddings that are, more or less static. We have not tested for drift on those things, and it's not something that's particularly like high in the consciousness, at least on my team yet. So that's really interesting to hear that that could be an issue. It's definitely worth looking more into that. But I would hope that, like, since we're using mostly like pretty commonly used pre-trained embeddings, if there were major issues with drift on those models, like it would affect a lot of people, and we would probably hopefully hear about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that's really cool, because just like knowing, like monitoring drift, like for embeddings, like does have a major impact on models that are in production. I'll definitely send you like some material on that.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from the audience. This is, okay. So this is, I'm not sure if this is your area, like with production in the cloud, but the question's on what was the thought process for deploying production solutions, basically on the cloud, like on-prem hybrid approaches. So I guess like, the different ways, and I guess it's very dependent on the flexibility and restrictions of your data, but if you have any experience with that.
Yeah, so we because we started with nothing, we kind of had the opportunity to build our infrastructure from the ground up, and we made it a cloud first, like cloud only platform that handles all of the AI APIs and data processing. But with that cloud infrastructure, we serve both cloud clients and on-premise customers. So Webex, the Webex contact center has, like 4 different versions of the software available right now. And we try to make our AI APIs accessible to all of them. But yeah, it's in the cloud primarily, just for kind of simplicity.
Awesome. Well, I mean, we're getting, close to time, but one question I always like hearing folks' feedback on is kind of like what tends to be like the hardest part of the job, and then like what's the most rewarding part of the job. And I mean, obviously this is very dependent on the positions, the team, working remote, which Elizabeth has said she does work fully remote with Cisco. So I'm just curious on kind of your experience there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say
it's hard and very open-ended. So just kind of take it how you'd like.
Yeah. I'd say one of the challenging parts is just, these models can be slippery. It's hard to know like if they're doing what you want them to do. And there's so many different clues and metrics that you'd want to look at, and trying to figure out what are the most important metrics and cues to look at is definitely a challenging part of the job, but it's also kind of one of the more rewarding parts of the job, because you have to get kind of creative about what you are looking at and what's going to be the best measure of success for your particular use case. And then another sort of rewarding part of that is you can then go to like the higher ups and the the people who don't necessarily understand machine learning and say like, my model is performing this well, like here's how we compare to our competitors, and here are all of the here's all the numbers, and that's a really satisfying and rewarding part of the job when you can go and do that with the ultimate confidence in the model, and that the work you've done is like thoroughly tested.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great way of saying it, because a lot of times the hardest parts are also the most rewarding. Like once you get past the very challenging things of knowing these models do fail silently, but when you're a model master, like, and it all goes well, it's a great feeling. Well, thank you so much for joining, Elizabeth. It was great seeing you again. It sounds like, you're killing it. I expect nothing less. And I'm really excited that, a lot of folks were able to join today. We'll also be getting like this recording out to our YouTube channel. Thank you for being kind of the guinea pig to start this out with us. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Amber. It was really great to see you, and an honor to talk with you here.
Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. And you're getting thanks from the audiences too. So perfect.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.